Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast, where it's all about turning your job search into a slam dunk. Your host is Angela Copeland.
Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast. I'm your host, Angela Copeland. On the phone with me today, I have Greg Taff in Oslo, Norway. Greg is a research scientist at the Norwegian Institute for Bioeconomy Research in Oslo. He conducts land use research in northern areas, primarily in the Arctic, Scandinavia, and the Baltics. Greg's specialties include GIS, remote sensing, and statistics. Greg, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, Angela.
Well, it's so good to chat with you. I've known you for a long time, and I've been really wanting to have you come on to share your experience, in Norway. So before we get too far in, because I already know the answer to this question, but I'd love it if you would share with us what exactly is it that you do. I gave your introduction, but tell me, what is it that you really do?
It's funny because I often don't even know what I do. But generally, before I came here to Norway, I was a geography professor in the U.S. at the University of Memphis. And I'm essentially a professor here without the teaching at the Research Institute. So I do academic research, and I sometimes advise graduate students. And my research focuses basically on whatever I can get money for from grants. Mm-hmm. I get grants through the Norwegian government sources and EU, and sometimes private sources. And I do research on land use change issues, basically how are we using the landscape and how could it be used better for sustainable environmental purposes, for better economic use. Some kinds of city planning I do, some, studying how climate change affects agriculture in the area, different things like this.
Oh, it's so interesting. I think sometimes you look at plants, it sounds like, and other times I know you're looking at sort of more things that involve animals. I mean, it seems like it's a whole range of things. Is that right?
Yeah. I actually tried to do research on kind of the nexus between the plant and animal world and the human world. So kind of how it is that humans behave and affect the landscape, and how does the landscape affect humans, and how can we make this this kind of connection better so that it works better for everyone.
Oh, that's perfect.
In the long term.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right now I'm working on a project. I'm hoping to work on a project we applied for funds for to prevent urban sprawl in the Oslo area.
Oh, that's so interesting. That's really interesting.
I hope that one gets funded. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Well, so you mentioned that you previously were a professor at the University of Memphis, which is, I met you obviously in Memphis, and you're clearly, you're from the U.S.
Yes.
I can't tell you how many people, job seekers, that I talk to who are interested, especially to move to Europe. And so almost every time I have a guest on who has any connection to Europe, I ask them for tips on how to move to Europe, and they always say to me, it's not possible. So that's what I'm really hoping to get out of today. But before we go down that path too far, I'd like to ask you first, what got you interested in Norway? How did you sort of become focused on Norway as a country?
Sure, and before I go too much into it, just so you know, not that it's easy, but it's certainly possible for an American to get a job in Europe. I'm one example, but there are many. When I was in college, I studied in France, actually, for a semester. Mm-hmm. And I had a break. I had a 1-week break. And I went to Sweden to visit a friend, and then I kind of looked at a map and saw that as you go north in Sweden, it looks like there's nothing up there, but it's a vast territory. So I just hopped on the train and went north, and I met this nice man in the train, and we chatted for hours because it's a really long ride. And I remember he had a terrible English accent, but he was a super nice guy. And he, at one point, asked what I was doing. And I said, I'm just touring around. And he said, well, I drive reindeer. if you like, you can come drive reindeer with me. Which is a pretty amazing offer. So I took him up on it. I drove reindeer in the Arctic Circle with this guy and his family, and I stayed with his family for about 3 days, and we had a blast. He had 3 kids and 8 reindeer and a horse, and we had a really good time. So I kept coming back and visiting and staying in touch with this family for years after that. And then when I became a geography professor, I just had an interest in the area and did some research on the climate change effect on the grasslands in the area and how that affects the reindeer migration patterns. Because as you may have heard a lot about, in the Arctic, the climate change is happening a lot faster than other places. So it was really an interesting geographical issue and how to adapt to the climate change. So I did some research as a professor in this area, and which is right on the border of Norway. So I actually came into Norway for some research as well in the north. And then I just saw a job opening looking for someone with my background in that area on that very kind of topic. So at first I thought it was a crazy idea to move to the Arctic, but then I said, well, I'm just going to go for it. So I applied and I got the job.
Oh, that's great. I think I've shared with you before that there was a time when I was traveling. I think I may have been in South America or something, and I was in a bar with a close friend of mine, and somehow Norway came up, and I started saying, I have this friend, Greg, and he works on reindeer migration due to the Arctic caps melting, and I'm kind of explaining it because it was in context for the conversation, and my close friend started shushing me because he thought that I'd had a little too much to drink, because he didn't think it was possible that anyone was actually studying reindeer migration.
Really?
Yeah. So
that's funny.
I remember
I
remember having to prove it later that Greg really does work on this. It's just, I think some people maybe picture that
there was a time I didn't know that reindeer were real.
Right.
I thought they were only in the fable of Santa Claus.
Right. I think that's possible for a lot of people. Well, you mentioned that you also have lived in France. Have you lived in any other countries?
Yeah, so I studied in France when I was in college for 3 months, and I lived in the country of Latvia for off and on for about a total of 2 years. I actually did my dissertation research in Latvia.
Mm-hmm.
And then I lived here. And actually, as a kid, until I was 5 years old, I lived in Holland. My parents are American, and my father got a job at a research institute, kind of like I have. And they stayed 8 years in the Netherlands. And so I was born there, and but I left when I was 5, so my memories are a bit thin from that era.
Oh, wow. Wow, that's so interesting. Well, so back to sort of your job in Norway, you mentioned that you saw the job posting and you applied, and then you just got the job. Walk us through that a little bit. Where did you find it? Is there a certain place that you would look for a job posting there? Like, what would you recommend?
Sure. And I understand that your listeners are primarily interested in maybe getting a job themselves in Europe, or this may be one of the reasons they're listening.
Right.
And this kind of gets to the point. And the way that I found the job was I'm on various listservs and get emails from different professional groups in my field, and it was one of the jobs that came up in my professional networking group on a listserv. And for jobs in Europe for Americans, in general, these are the kinds of ways that are best to find them, as opposed to like cold calling or just looking online for random jobs. And the reason I'm saying, and not that looking online is a bad idea. Obviously, there's all kinds of job postings there. But my point is that you really want to look for a job in your field that you have some experience with, and it's a little bit easier for people a little more advanced in their careers to get jobs in Europe. Now, there are some exceptions that you can get some entry-level things, like in internships. But in general, it's hard for an American to get a job in Europe because your employer has help you get a visa, which usually entails proving that they can't find someone within Europe that is more qualified than you are. People who live in the European Union, they can easily get a job in another European country. But for us Americans, it's a little bit more challenging. And for that reason, it's good to, if you're a little bit more advanced in your career, you've had 3 to 5 years or more experience in a certain field, then it's a lot easier to, for a company to be able to claim that somebody else isn't more qualified than you.
That's interesting. So how did you go about finding these listservs? Like, where do you look for them?
Oh, that's a good question. There are various professional groups, basically.
Okay.
They're networking groups, or they're, and certainly this is within the academic sphere.
Mm-hmm.
They're quite common. You just go by topic, and they're usually groups. They may be national or international groups that have an interest in a certain topic. They may have an annual conference,
mm-hmm.
and you get on that listserv for information about when the conference is, when new books are published in the field, and usually there'll be some job listings. And as I was a professor at the University of Memphis, I wasn't really even looking for a job. I was looking for a job for my graduate students who were graduating.
Mm.
And that's when I came across this one. And so that's how I found it.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, so you mentioned the
that's my first recommendation.
Yeah, you mentioned the EU, requirements and everything. I believe that Norway is not part of the EU. Is that right?
That's correct.
So do they do they follow the same rules around employment as the rest of the EU, or are they kind of in their own boat on that?
Well, this is an interesting topic. For EU citizens and Norway citizens, Norwegian citizens, they have an agreement, even though Norway is not in the EU, that they can work in each other's countries.
Okay.
Without a special visa. I think you actually get a visa, but it's not like you have to apply like you do as an American. It's pretty much guaranteed. But from the perspective of an American, you actually, when you want a job in Europe, you apply to get a visa in a specific country.
Mm-hmm.
And if you get it, then you actually only have a visa for that country. And then you can travel around to all the other countries in the EU and Norway, because it's within what's called the Schengen area of
mm-hmm.
free travel. But your visa is only for that particular country, and the requirements for visas are very different in the different countries. So actually, it matters a lot where you're applying.
Oh, interesting.
Which country you're applying to.
How long, generally speaking, can you renew your visa over and over again? Like, how long could you stay in Europe potentially without being a permanent resident?
Right. Well, if you get a proper job in Europe, then usually you will get a working visa,
mm-hmm.
which lasts a certain number of years. Here in Norway, for Americans, it'll last either 3 or 4 or 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
Depending on which type of work visa you get. For me, it was a 3-year visa.
Mm-hmm.
Then I could renew for another 3 years. And then after those 3 years, which is a total of 6, I could either apply for citizenship, which I don't think I'll do because I want to maintain my American citizenship,
mm-hmm.
or you can indefinitely extend your I'm sorry. After the first 3 years, I don't have another work visa. I actually got my permanent residence.
Wow, that's so interesting.
And you have to. I'm sorry?
That's really interesting. Is that a little bit like getting your green card in the U.S.?
Exactly.
Wow.
That's essentially what I got after this 3-year period. Some places it'll take 4 or 5 years,
mm-hmm.
but you pretty much, I can't say for all countries, but I think generally after about that period you can apply for permanent residence. And as long as you have a regular full-time job that shows that you make enough money and you don't get in any trouble,
mm-hmm.
then usually you can get your permanent residence.
Wow, that's so interesting, and congratulations.
Thank you.
That's very exciting. Well, so one other thing, when it comes to, you mentioned the idea of, looking online at websites. From what I remember, it seems like in Norway, there is one website that all jobs are required to be listed on. Is that true? There's
I am afraid I don't know the answer.
You don't know?
To that.
Okay.
There is a site called fin.no. That's F like Frank, I-N like Nancy, another N like Nancy, .no as in Norway. And it's in Norwegian, but you can Google translate it. And there are a lot of jobs posted there. One site within Norway you can look for.
Okay.
And I mean,
that may be the site I'm thinking of. Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
That may be the site I'm thinking of.
Yeah.
Sure.
And there are all kinds of websites that are advertising jobs in Europe for English speakers and for Americans. And they're certainly worth a look.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you mentioned that if you're further along in your career, it's easier possibly to get a job, in Europe than if you're more junior sometimes.
Yes.
Are there certain fields that you think are more likely for people to be able to easily move to Europe versus other fields that may be harder?
Absolutely. Basically, fields where they have a demand, professional demand, and they don't have enough workers, and they tend to be a lot of high-tech industries. Engineering is also big. I also saw I looked up some information. I see that a list here is engineering, information technology, healthcare, and teaching are some key fields.
Teaching?
And I would add to that academics. There's a lot of academics and research institutes throughout Europe that come from America because academics tend to study such very focused niches. It's very easy for an employer to say, we can't find somebody who's just like this in Europe.
Huh.
So academics, whether it's at a university or a research institute, is also a very good way to go if you're looking for a job in Europe.
I could see that. Well, what about the teaching, though? I mean, what kinds of things would we teach that wouldn't be available locally?
Well, the teaching... I'm sorry?
What would we teach that wouldn't be available locally?
What would we teach, you said? I'm sorry?
Yeah, what subjects do you think, what subjects would people be more likely to teach? Mm-hmm.
Well, as I understand, I'm not so knowledgeable about this, but what I do know is that teaching English is the biggest opportunity for Americans in Europe. And I think it's gotten more difficult recently in Western Europe, actually. But in Eastern Europe, there are a lot of options. So if you're interested in going to a really unique and newly vibrant area like Czech or Slovakia, Poland, the Baltic states, Romania, these areas in East Europe are always looking for Americans and other English speakers to teach English.
Wow, that's really interesting. I would assume people that do that, maybe they're early in their career. Is that right? Or
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, this is one of the areas where if you are, you're young and relatively new out of college, there are opportunities to work in Europe as an English teacher, and that's a good thing to know about.
Huh. That's really interesting. Well, what about, are there any... I
was going to add that there's also, more recently, some of the countries in Europe have established new kinds of visas that are interesting.
Okay.
That are for freelancers, or they call them digital nomads, because a lot of people these days are doing some kind of work that they can do from anywhere. And as long as you can show that you have enough income, like if you have your own business or you're a consultant and you're doing work that you can take, you can do from anywhere, a lot of countries may consider giving you a visa if you apply for these special kinds of visas. So that's an interesting new opportunity that you can look up online to find out more information about which countries offer them. I know that France is one of the countries that offers such a visa.
Wow. Do you know anyone who's done the digital nomad visa?
No, I met one person who was kind of doing it. He didn't actually get a visa, but he was, I'd call a digital nomad. He had to be working on a certain 8-hour shift.
Mm-hmm.
But he could do it from anywhere, and he would just travel between countries, and he would spend as long as you can on a travel tourist visa in one country, and then go out of the EU and back. Then he'd have to go to the U.S. for a while again, but he kind of was a true nomad and really enjoying just living anywhere. The only problem was he had to be like on working during the American hours, so basically 9 to 5 in one of the time zones in the U.S., which were evening hours in Europe. So he wasn't able to, join friends and things for dinner often. But he had the rest of his time free to explore Europe and had his weekends off. It was pretty exciting.
That's really interesting. A few years ago, I met someone in a similar situation. He was living, I think, in London, and he was staying in hotels. He was also American, doing digital type work. He was like a programmer, and he was also going from country to country and just staying in hotels and doing his work. And I guess he had put all his things in the U.S. like into a storage while he did that. I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, that sounds a lot like what this guy was doing. I think he was doing Airbnb because it was a little cheaper and he could feel a little bit more like a local when he was in these countries. But this new information age certainly has opened up new opportunities for all kinds of ways to work and places.
Absolutely. Oh, that's so interesting. I'm going to have to look that up now. Well, aside from work, like what are other options if we want to live in Europe? Like what are our other choices?
I'm sorry, I don't quite understand. You mean it?
Well, I mean,
I'm
assuming that say that we want to go to Europe, but we maybe don't have a type of career that would be considered special or unique for Europe. I mean, is it possible that we might go to graduate school there and that would be like an opportunity or, I mean...
Oh, yeah, okay, got you. Absolutely. One way is, and actually one way I've seen online that they recommend, is to get a student visa, certainly. And graduate school is a great idea. It's a lot easier to get a student visa even than a work visa. So you can come for, and that's a great way to get going. If you come here for a year or two, get a master's degree, or even an undergraduate, then you're so hooked up at that point, and you may be able to, through your network that you create, find an employer that's willing to sponsor you. Because that's basically what you need, is an employer willing to sponsor you to help, which means that they will submit from their end the necessary paperwork to get you a visa.
Yeah.
So a student visa is a great way to start, and there are certain internship programs. I forget if I mentioned that already in this talk, but there's some internship programs that students in the U.S. can get that are just a few months in Europe, and that can also kind of get your foot in the door to learn or to to network and meet people that might be able to bring you over for a longer period.
Yeah, one of my younger brothers actually went to graduate school at Cambridge in England, and after he was finished, he considered whether to come back to the U.S. to work or should he stay there. And my recommendation at the time was, if you have any interest in working in Europe, do it now, because it's going to be much easier to find a job while you're living there than it would be if you came back and decided you had an interest in going to work in Europe. And so, he can always come back to the U.S. at a later time, but he was able to secure a job, and I think he's worked there for, I guess, 2 or 3 years now, and that's really worked out well, versus if he had been in the U.S., I think it would have been quite hard to find that same job. Yeah,
I agree. Definitely, if you're young and you're a student, or even if you're not so young and you want to go back and get a master's a little bit later in life, and then it's a great way. You can go to Europe to do this, and then you can network while you're there. Of course, there are a lot of master's degrees in English now in countries throughout Europe. Of course, England or the UK is the only place where everyone speaks English in Europe. But there are options, so there's maybe more options in the UK, but there are English master's degrees in almost every country in Europe as well.
And just I know this is kind of a generalization, but I'm curious, how does the cost of graduate school compare in Europe versus the U.S.? Is it similar, or is it, on average, would you think of it as cheaper or more? Well,
it certainly differs by country, and in the U.S., for instance, I mean, if you want to get a professional master's degree, it's very expensive. In most schools, it can be a minimum of $10,000 and up to $50,000 a year in the U.S. But if you're doing a more academic degree in the U.S., you can often get it funded through either teaching assistantship or research assistantship, or even sometimes just a scholarship. But in Europe, in general, the actual tuition costs are much cheaper. In Norway, for instance, it's free.
Oh, no matter what? Even if you're not from Norway?
Yeah, no matter what, it's free. Now, that doesn't mean that it's easy to get to fund a master's degree, because you still have to have your living costs. And as an American on a student visa, you're not allowed to work. So that can be challenging. Or there may be some stipulations you can work up to 10 or some hours in certain situations. So that actually, you have to look into that. But living costs in Norway in particular are very high. It's the highest. It was the highest in the world until recently. So it's not always so cheap even still, but it's certainly a lot cheaper than paying $40,000 a year for a master's program in the U.S.
Yeah. I think, it's funny. I think a lot of people don't think of Norway as an expensive country if they've never visited. But I remember when I visited, I was really surprised first at how expensive things were in general. But the thing that really drove the point home was I would ask, locals that I would meet, where do you recommend that I go to dinner? Like, I'm looking for a restaurant. And almost never could they give me a restaurant recommendation, because they really rarely, it seemed like anyway, they rarely go to restaurants to eat. So. Yeah,
I can maybe put things in perspective as well. It's definitely true. I now live in Oslo. I moved here about 6 months ago, and I moved to Norway 5 years ago. And when I moved to Norway, I moved to a town called Tromsø in the very north, in the Arctic. And up there, things were more expensive than Oslo, because there's less competition and everything has to be shipped quite a distance to the north. But I moved in, and I was excited to explore the town up there. And I met my neighbors, and I said, I love to eat out. What do you like you said? I said, do you have any recommendations for places to eat? And they looked at me and they said, oh, we love to eat out. Yeah, we love it too. We eat out 4 times a year. And I was like, I didn't even understand exactly at that point. But then I realized that unless you want just a street kebab or a hot dog on the street or something, if you want a real meal and you want to, like, say, have an appetizer and a meal and a dessert and a glass of wine, an average price there is now like $70 to $80, even $90 for one person for dinner. And that's only after the crown has fallen. Before it would have been over $100. So now here in Oslo, it can be half or even a third of that. So it's if you're paying $30 for dinner, it's not so bad, but still not cheap.
Wow. I remember I saw you when I was in Norway, and at some point I think we went out and had a pizza it was like a modest sized pizza. It was enough, but not huge. And I think we each had like a beer or something. And I remember it was like still really expensive.
Yeah, I don't remember what we paid, but I did order a personal pizza to my office once, so it included delivery in the town of Tromsø. And I remember it was a decent pizza, but I paid $50 for that.
No, for a personal pan pizza?
One person. That's right. But that was before the fall of the crown, so now it would only be, $38.
It's just amazing.
But Norway is the most expensive country in Europe. Maybe Liechtenstein and Switzerland are about the same, but it varies drastically. If you go to Spain, for instance, it's cheaper than in the U.S. And certainly all of Eastern Europe is much cheaper than the U.S. Germany and France, Holland are about similar. And even within those countries, there's vast differences.
I'm a big fan of Ireland. There's a lot of hiring going on in Dublin, especially from U.S. like tech companies. And it's not cheap, but it seemed reasonable. So.
Right. I've only been there briefly, but I do know that Ireland is also... Actually, I don't know exactly, but I've heard there's some because of the connection between the U.S. and Ireland, is that it's easy for Irish to get hired in the U.S., and I believe there's a reciprocal agreement there that makes getting visas in Ireland a lot easier than other countries in the U.S. I mean, in Europe.
It may be some. I
So that
don't
could
know.
be something.
Yeah, I've talked to a number of like career coaches there and companies there, and they still seem to really favor first Irish and second European, and
Ah,
I didn't see very much consideration. So
could be, yeah.
I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not. I don't know this too well either, so I really shouldn't talk about that one.
No, it's okay.
But but there is another whole kind of class of jobs that I want to bring up that
Sure.
we haven't gotten to mention yet, and that's that if you want to come to Europe, one of the best ways could be just to get a job in an American company, an internet like a multinational or one of the big international presence, and they often will have jobs either full-time or for a few years that you can go to Europe. So if you get just with a big company like Johnson & Johnson or an airline company or FedEx or DHL, they have a lot of jobs here. Some of the big consulting companies and big financial firms, banks, they will often have jobs in Europe. And if it's an American company, it's easy for them to send an American to Europe. And actually then you even get some certain tax breaks and things that can be very good from a financial perspective as well. So that's a very different way to come. And also, finally, I'll mention the State Department. If you have an interest in working for the State Department, there are certainly options in every country in the world. And you can browse their website. There, if you have certain skills like statistics, geography are actually big ones. Some, I think, human resources type of positions. There's a lot of options within the State Department as well.
Oh, that's very interesting. I wouldn't have thought of that. Well, so I'm curious, are you aware, are there certain places in Europe where you think it would be, you kind of mentioned a couple, but do you know of anywhere, if we're interested to move, that we should be looking first? Like, are there certain areas that seem more likely to be open to Americans than others, or is it hard to say?
Well, I would say less about where they're open to Americans and more about where the economy is good. Because right now Europe is in quite a stressed situation in terms of the economy.
Okay.
Certainly Southern Europe, I think among youth, or not youth, but among young workers under, 25 or something, in Spain, I think something like a 40% unemployment rate.
Ooh.
And Spain and Italy and Greece, all of these, the workers are coming north because they can't get jobs there. So there's certainly opportunities in every country, but they're going to be a lot harder in these southern countries and in Eastern Europe as well. Like I said, except for teaching English in Eastern Europe, which is an option. But Eastern Europe also doesn't pay very well. But, it should pay local salaries so that you can at least get by in that country.
Mm.
But the good economies right now are Norway is probably the best, even though oil, the price of oil is down and there's some job loss. It's still a really booming economy here.
Mm-hmm.
Holland is always a good one, and Belgium with the headquarters of the EU. These are top ones, and Germany is always doing very well. So I think those are your best bet to look, as well as France and Switzerland, if you're just looking for countries to go to, and of course the UK.
That's great.
Yeah.
I mean,
certainly, if you have language skills, that's key if you want to come to Europe.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't, I actually didn't know Norwegian before I came here, but I didn't need it for this job. And for a lot of very high-tech jobs, you may only need English. And obviously the UK you can go to speaking English, but the rest of Europe, if you have language skills, it's going to be huge, in terms of where you can go.
That makes a lot of sense. A lot of sense. Do you feel like the Brexit situation has changed the landscape for someone looking for a job in Europe at all?
That's a good question. I haven't heard much talk about it, and I don't think it would affect Americans getting a job in Europe. It just may affect Europeans getting a job in the UK and maybe Americans getting a job in the UK. I don't know enough about that, but it hasn't really made an impact in terms of, I think, Americans getting a job in the rest of Europe, for sure.
Okay, that makes sense. Well, so I'm curious, are there, moving abroad, even if it's like something we really want to do and we're dreaming of, it can still be very intimidating. And I'm wondering if there are any other tips. I know, I remember when you moved, it seemed like you were able to relocate some of your belongings, take them with you from the U.S. to Norway. Seemed like, what were you able to do that made it easier for you? Are there tips that you would have for someone who's never done it?
Right. Well, if you get a job here with a company that, especially a higher, mid to higher level career position, then they will often pay for the move, which means they'll move your stuff. And I was lucky to be able to get that, and so I moved my things to Norway. And that was kind of nice to feel a little bit of home, even though I was in this crazy little Arctic town in the middle of winter with no sunlight, and I didn't know anybody. That was nice to have a little bit of comfort with my things. But I think some of the bigger issues are that a lot of Europe, the culture isn't so different from America. So we come in thinking we kind of understand the culture, and we fit in on a very, basic level very easily. But then as you stay a little bit longer and you get into more social dynamics, you kind of realize that there really are cultural differences, and you have to be ready for that so that you don't get upset by them too much, and you don't get flustered by feeling a little bit out of sorts, trying to understand why people are acting in certain ways. In a lot of ways, it's very exciting and interesting because you can explore the way they do things. Great new food, of course, that's my favorite. And there's a lot of cultures here, so there's all kinds of perspectives, and it's really fascinating and exciting. But, every culture is different, and we're, in the U.S., unless you're living in a big city, like New York, with all kinds of, people from everywhere, you may not think as much as a European does about how different cultures are, because they're interacting so much here. So I guess I would just say, think about that ahead of time and be ready for it, and that kind of helps prepare.
No, that's great advice. I could definitely see that.
Yeah. And I'd say the biggest thing is if somebody's thinking about this, the key is that it doesn't have to be forever. So if it's not such a big deal, it's not like, oh my God, should I move to Europe or not? And this is going to change my life and everything. Of course, it will change your life because you'll get a bigger perspective, a new perspective on certain things. And but you can always go back to the U.S. and it may be a little bit more challenging applying for a job from Europe. That's something to be aware of. But certainly, the U.S. isn't going anywhere, and it's not like any decision has to be final. So I'd say if you're out there and you're thinking about coming to Europe and it's been a dream of yours, go for it. You can always go back.
I love that. And the other thing is, sometimes when you apply to go back, because you've got this international experience, that's also very intriguing, possibly to a U.S. company.
Yeah, absolutely, especially for companies that do business in more than one country.
Sure.
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, this has been great, and I'm curious to know, where can we go to learn more about you and the Norwegian Institute for Bioeconomy Research?
Sure. Well, it's called NIBIO. Is the acronym NIBIO. You can just go to nibio.no, which stands for Norwegian Institute for Bioeconomy Research. And if you just Google Gregory Taff and NIBIO, you'll find me there. I'm also working on a little side, or kind of a big side project called Purple Dinner, and you can find me there too. PurpleDinner.com is I told you a bit about it, Angie, and this is a website where it's basically like Airbnb, but for dinner. So if you want to have dinner in someone's house, particularly when you're traveling, it can be a nice way to meet people and enjoy dinner instead at a home instead of a restaurant. And so you can look up purpledinner.com and you can find me there as well.
Oh, that's great. Well, I'm definitely I'll share the links to both of these websites in the show notes and on the website so everyone can check them out. I am very excited about your the Purple Dinner site and the whole idea of having, that connection and community while you're traveling. So I'm so excited that you shared that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, basically, if you want to imagine you're traveling in Italy, instead of going to a great Italian restaurant, which would be great, but one night maybe you can have an Italian grandmother serve you dinner in her living room, and that could be, I think, an amazing experience. And on the website, by the way, within a few months, I'm going to come out with a really nice new website. Right now, the current website needs to be updated, but it's coming soon. So if you do have a look at it, then come back in a couple of months, and we're going to be roaring and ready to go.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, Greg, thank you so much for joining me. This has been excellent.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to talk to you, Angela. Thanks a lot for having me on the show. And I look forward to reading more of your updates and listening to more shows.
Oh, thank you. And thanks, everyone, for listening. Thanks to those of you who sent me questions. You can send me your questions to Angela@CopelandCoaching.com. You can also send me questions via Twitter. I'm @CopelandCoach. And on Facebook, I'm Copeland Coaching. Don't forget to help me out. Subscribe on iTunes and leave me a review.
Thank you for listening to the Copeland Coaching Podcast today with your host, Angela Copeland. Tune in next time to get more great tips on turning your job search into a slam dunk.